A point strikes me here that the ordering of these antecedents needs to take into account not just the regularities in the language, the front end use of the language, but also regularities in the evaluator itself. Like, you might not use many self-evaluating expressions in your program, but everything terminates in a self-evaluating expression in the evaluator. Or, I don't know, some percentage of the calls to the evaluator terminate with accessing this antecedent. Accessing, I don't know what verb to use there. So like putting cond so low in the stack seems mistaken because cond is one of the most commonly used. Similarly with if is also low. You might, and here's a point that if you might say cond is used more often than if, so cond should be higher in the stack. So this is a concrete example. Cond decomposes into if. So each usage of cond, each antecedent in cond is going to correspond to its own if expression. So if I have a cond with three statements, three antecedents, that turns into three if expressions. I think three. So having the if expression higher in the antecedent stack pays off. curly braces around definitions. Yeah, I'm not getting this. If this were only for establishing side effects. But eval first expression expressions, if this is evaluating the arguments to a procedure as sequence of expressions in a procedure body. That's not what it's saying. It's not saying arguments to a procedure. It's saying that there's a procedure body consists of a sequence of expressions. Okay, then I still don't know what this is doing. Running eval. But since we open up new expressions with paren, the first argument for each expression, so each expression is going to be either self-evaluating or a list, or maybe everything will be a list. Okay, and then the first expression, when evaluated, let me think here. Eval first expression expressions. Let's go back up to the evaluator. So self-evaluating. So all of these operations are going to be like definition question mark, quoted question mark, assignment question mark are going to take the car of an expression and ask an identifying question about the car of the expression. So you have a quoted expression, well, you have a list containing the terms of an expression, and these are questions asked about the first term in each such list, down to the point where each such list consists only of one term. So when we call eval first expression expressions, that first expression is going to mean car of this, presumably. Similarly, last expression will mean, well, this won't be a null check. Instead, this will be whether CDR is null. And then we evaluate this last. So this has the structure of a non-tail recursive procedure, but I don't see how this works as a non-tail recursive procedure. We send this to eval, the first expression will be a list. It contains an operator and operands, or self-evaluating. We send in the environment. Okay, but again, unless this is producing a side effect, I don't understand what this is, what these two in a row are doing. This is throwing off the pretty printing. Here, eval assignment, expression environment, set variable value. Assignment variable, which again is going to be car, and then eval assignment value, which would be CDR. Expression could be, well, it could be however, it could be arbitrarily many arguments that are being sent off to eval along with the environment. Here, eval definition, expression environment, define variable, which I assume does roughly the same thing as set variable value. Well, roughly the same thing. Not clear what I mean by that. Because this is going to have to establish the variable, whereas this is going to set a variable that has already been established. Definition variable, expression. Okay. So this is also going to be CDR. This will be car. It's all these. Yeah, it's makes me think the intent behind. We have a dozen distinct aliases for car and CDR. In this long sequence. And the idea is that, well, the aliases are self-describing. They're self-describing in their particular, in their then current use. I mean that, let's see. Let's take this example down here. Definition variable, expression. Okay. So, my complaint here, or my observation, I wonder if this obscures rather than reveals. Why would I suppose so? I think I lean more towards understanding the syntax. As in, the operation of this system makes more sense as a syntax, as a pile of syntax, rather than as a pile of semantics. Especially if you're explaining what the evaluator is. Like if you're trying to explain the mechanics of the evaluator, how it parses a program, the mechanics seem more salient than the semantics, and in this case we're obscuring the mechanics, obscuring the syntax by forwarding the semantics. Okay. Notice that we cannot tell whether the metacircular evaluator evaluates operands from left to right or from right to left. its evaluation order is inherited from the underlying Lisp. If the arguments to consts in list of values are evaluated from left to right, then list of values will evaluate operands from left to right. Right, operands from, and if the arguments to consts are evaluated from right to left, then list of values will evaluate operands from right to left. Okay, let's look at list of values. Actually, I have to take a break here shortly. Let's see. I'll leave that on the screen. I don't know chat up. It doesn't matter. Let's see. And what is this telling me? Alright, so if I wanted to paint this... I don't know how many we'll need. Okay. Guard your eyes, I might misclick and then turn our pleasing dark blue. Oh yeah, I can err on the inside actually. Dodge that. Yes. Okay. Now what? Okay, so this is saying if we evaluate from left to right. Yeah, well again, this is using the horrible non-tail recursive form that makes much less sense to me. Yeah, the interlocutor also spoke as if the non-tail recursive form is the natural and understandable, easy to understand form of procedures, which I thought was strange. Thinking about not an object, but, well, okay, yeah, a primitive data object and its state over time. Like, there isn't a primitive data object here until you reach the end, and then you get it stacked up. Everything is in the stack, whereas with a tail recursive procedure, at least according to how I understand it, you build up the object one step at a time. So for that matter, if we did list of values. Yeah, so we could do this in a tail recursive fashion. Define list of values to exp environment if null CDR expressions. No, this would actually just be if yeah, okay, no operands expressions, and then return null otherwise. Alright, so we're gonna have output. Otherwise run list of values to with CDR expressions. I think here. Yeah, so rest operands expressions const eval first operand expressions environment onto output and list, let's see, no, just environment, yeah. Okay, so now naturally this is going to evaluate our expressions. So we start at the front of the list and that goes to the end of the list, so we evaluate left to right. Well, I guess I'm not sure what this means by left to right. I might not be able to illustrate it with paint. Let's see. Alright, so let me interpret this question. So list of values expression. So this is const eval first operand expressions environment, and this is list of values operating on CDR of expressions. Okay. Now, so if this evaluates from left to right, we get the typical stack buildup where the first evaluated expression remains in front. Whereas if const, for whatever reason, evaluated the second expression first, if const this element, the return of list of values onto eval first operand expressions, this would be evaluated first, it would be at the end of the list, and then these would be stacked in front. Is, I think, what's happening here. Now this would produce, if it turned out that const evaluated from right to left, this would produce some horrible yeah, this would be some miserable construction, which we could illustrate by putting list of values over here. This will be CDR, this will be car. And we could just do const car expressions and skip the evaluation process. And then we don't need the environment. Okay, if null. Alright, and now if I use this here instead. Now, instead values 2, list 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and null. That's not what I expected. Hold on. Oh, right. There we go. That's the horrible expression we're trying to avoid. This should return output. Okay. A construction that always evaluates from left to right. I still don't really know what that means, though. I get a flicker of what I think it means when I read through this again. I mean, yeah, let's try to fix this picture in my head. If no operands, expressions return null, otherwise const eval first operand to expressions environment onto list of values. So this would put the first output at the end of the list. If const was const B onto A. And so I guess we'd say that this is also evaluating from right to left because we're putting the first operand at the end. Okay, but that again assumes that const evaluates from left to right. And we could probably do some hack logic, like if I said, like we could test what const does in our procedure. Let's see. If greater than car of const 5 onto 4, then left to right pseudocode, otherwise right to left. And here, I mean, it's a little bit confusing why const would evaluate right to left, but it would be baffling if car selected something other than the first in the list, because befuddling, baffling. You would be baffled, because I mean, well, there would be no, like, what would you choose if it wasn't the first in the list? Would you choose the second? But why? Okay, so this logic seems like it would work, but I don't know if that's what the author is looking for here. Though if what we're trying to do is ship, well, yeah, so we could do list of values L to R. Okay. Alright, and then we would do, okay, let's do this as right to left. Okay. And here we will plug in if greater than car of cons 5 for 4, then that means that cons works left to right, and this already does right to left in that case. Okay. What are we going to do if otherwise? Well, yeah, then we just do as I said, hacky solution. I was upfront about the hackiness of the solution. And then if we want left to right, same idea, define list of values R to L expressions, L to R expressions out of the environment. Okay, except that here we're going to take this code. If no operands expressions. Now, why are we going to have non-tail recursive in one case and tail recursive in the other? Doesn't matter. Wait, why couldn't we reverse? Let me think here. Right, well, reversing these only does this. It just produces this horrible non-outcome. So instead we're going to get the non-tail recursive to force left to right. So this will be if greater than car cons 5 4 4 then now this assumes the typical left to right for const evaluation. Otherwise, const alright, there you go. Problem solved. representing expressions. The evaluator is reminiscent of the symbolic differentiation program discussed. Yes, that's immediately came to mind. Reminiscent of the symbolic differentiation program discussed in section 2.3.2. Okay. Though we failed at that, I assume we would do better now. In both programs, we used data abstraction to decouple the general rules of operation from the details of how expressions are represented. In the differentiation program, this meant that the same differentiation procedure could deal with algebraic expressions in prefix form, in infix form, or in some other form. For the evaluator, this means that the syntax of the language being evaluated is determined solely by the procedures that classify and extract pieces of expressions. So similarly, with this example, this exercise, where how we would have to write out our argument lists would depend on, well, no, I assume we wouldn't write a Lisp where we had to write our arguments in reverse order. I mean, I assume, well, what would it even mean, though? What would it mean for the arguments to be in reverse order? That does not become clear after working through this exercise. What do I mean? So we would have our arguments to our procedure. No, rather, we would have our expressions. Oh, right. We would have our expressions, right, because list of values is used for, let me see. I don't know, I'm thinking of eval sequence, I think. Procedure arguments. When eval processes a procedure application, it uses list of values to produce the list of arguments to which the procedure is to be applied. List of values takes as an argument the operands of the combination. It evaluates each operand and returns a list of the corresponding values. Let's see. So this is for the arguments. So I mean, naively, having list of values process your arguments in reverse means you'd have to input your arguments in the other direction. But again, what would that even mean? Like there's nothing to the order of. No, but there is an order to. Yeah, okay, yeah, actually, there is an order to the formal parameters. So the idea is that if I had a sequence, if I had formal parameters. Formal parameters like this, I would need to input environment and then expressions. Hence the conclusion that we would not write a language where we had to input our arguments in the reverse order, as we would have to do here with environment first and then expressions. Okay, but in other regards, the syntax of the language being evaluated is determined solely by the procedures that classify and extract pieces of expressions. Which in a way is as banal as saying that, yeah, I know it's as banal as saying that whether you have to input your arguments forward to front to back instead of back to front depends on how the arguments are processed, how the procedures classify and extract pieces of expressions. Yeah, but it does. When you reflect on it, though, it's not that banal. It's not so banal. The syntax of the language being evaluated is determined solely by the procedures that classify and extract pieces of expression. Yeah, well, I mean, particularly if you haven't contemplated this question, where does the syntax come from? Where do the rules for syntax come from? You might think that the rules of syntax were established sort of before, well, I mean, yeah, it might be that the rules of syntax were established before the evaluator was written, and then the evaluator was written in such a way as to force that kind of syntax, force those rules for syntax. Then, using Aristotelian causation description here, where by design we construct the evaluator to enforce a particular syntax, but then efficiently or sort of mechanically what leads to the syntax is the evaluator being such as it is. Yeah, I might be misinterpreting what the word syntax means in this context, because I'm thinking of rules for what symbol strings are valid inputs, whereas the specification of the syntax of our language begins by defining what is self-evaluating. It's about time for exercise in thinking out loud. I didn't end up using this. That's fine. Started reading these names, they're strange. Alright, I'll be right back. always ready. People as patterns in their frames of experience. This imagines, in a way, this imagines people as sort of melting into their environments. What do I mean? Well, one point here, This description might sound instantaneous. If you take a frame, the discrete unit for this mode of description, you say, you say the person that is a pattern in its own experience is either perceptible within a frame or is perceptible across frames. To the extent that we can identify the person, I don't want to say person, the human, the entity. I don't want to say person because I want to reserve, well, maybe we don't reserve that term then. I want to reserve person for doing ethics. We could say base person and then we could say ethics person. I want to reserve person for talking about contracts, for instance. When we start, or if we get to the point where we can talk about compound patterns, whatever that means, in one's environment. But okay, persons as patterns in experience. Okay. And now we take one frame of my experience, and what we see is a distribution of objects. Okay, and now if we wanted to identify me out of the image, putting aside me, in the image, me in the audio, but again, most obviously me in the image. We're putting that aside and we're saying that I am the distribution of objects surrounding me in a frame. And then we start accounting for me as, I guess, motivations for gathering these objects around. I guess I'm more interested in persons as patterns in experience between frames, from one frame to the next, where a person is like a function that explains why beginning at one frame ends, or explains why one frame is followed up by a second frame. Like we're drawing, well, we have two frames that are continuous, to the extent that experience is continuous anyway. And we've discretized this, we have a finite number of frames. And well, you could discretize experience, you'd want to do that anyway, I suppose. What do I mean? A finite number of frames. You can get at the idea that there's a finite number of frames by saying that there's a minimal duration of time. Though, on further examination, I think we will find that the minimal unit of time depends on circumstances. The minimum duration, the minimum frame length, frame time, as in each frame needs to account for its local neighborhood of time. And then a sequence of frames fills out a timeline by having each frame occupy its local area, as it were, local stretch. And now the point is, suppose I have an object, could be could be these. Okay, and now I freeze this frame, and then I give you an accounting for my input. Okay, and my input is into the weights
Now what is my idea? We want the idea that one frame might not be enough to explain an input. Well, maybe we have a motivation to account for inputs by referencing objects that are in the frames. Or I think the idea that I'm trying to get at in my head at the moment, I think the idea is that if I gave you an input, what form is that description going to take? What form, what type, what form is my description of an input going to take? Now, one particularly easy way of doing this is to say that my input is whatever is going to give rise. My input will be whatever it had to have been in order that the output I got was such that it was, such as it was. It's a perfect definition. All right, it says my input is whatever it had to have been in order that the output was such as it was. It's perfect, it's perfectly precise and exact, or it's utterly vacuous. You might lean towards the utterly vacuous side. I lean towards the perfectly informative side, but the point here is that we want to use upcoming frames to reach back and explain the input. Or we might say that the complexity of the input, accounting for the complexity of the input, requires reference to the complexity of the output. I need to talk about how the weight behaves after the input in order to tell you which input I chose. With the idea being, we could have seen other outputs, and those would have had different inputs. Different outputs would have required different inputs. Really what I want here is an example of a case where we find one frame to be inadequate for accounting for the input. And then the idea is we could add in more frames. And the more frames we added in, the more options we would have for describing the input, for correlating the input with the output. So we reduce the interval duration lower and lower and lower so that we have more frames that we can point at where we can identify critical states of the object, for instance, and use those critical states of the object to elaborate on the input. And then the follow-up idea is that this hits a limit. We don't need additional frames beyond a certain point. Adding additional frames does not grant us more capacity to correlate the input with the output or to complexify the input. Where we are complexifying the input to match it up to the complexities we identify out of the output. Saw a large spider in the house earlier. How do you suppose that got in? Well, I've been opening up the door occasionally. I suppose it crawled in when I opened the door, though I rapidly closed the door thereafter. So the spider must have been in wait. Strange that the spider should find itself in such a position. Had to be right there when the door opened. Well, you see, spiders like the sense of rushing wind. Why? Because rushing wind indicates a pressure differential, which indicates a doorway, often. For these spiders, for house spiders, a pressure differential, air pressure differential indicates a door. It doesn't generally indicate a door. And what do I suppose it means for there to be an indication to a spider? What do I mean? An indication to a spider. Are the spiders thinking about their circumstances? And well, if I say the spider walked into the wind because it wanted to get inside the house, then I'm attributing purpose-directedness to this activity. Whereas, if anything, I might want to attribute purpose-directedness to putting one foot in front of the other, one leg in front of the other. A little bit distinct to attribute to the spider the purpose-directedness of walking as opposed to the purpose-directedness of walking into the house. It walked the way that pleased it to do, and at the end of that activity, it was inside the house. So we're saying given how we already want to speak about such matters, it already makes sense. We can already make sense of the idea that there is a minimal duration. In a way, this is like the minimal number of snapshots. It's like the minimal number of snapshots we would need to give as much complexity to the description of our input as we are motivated to provide. Or, to carry it over to the person's perspective, the minimal duration is the just noticeable difference. Now, one idea here would be I could flash your vision red for an instant. And you wouldn't notice it because an instant lasts 0 time. No, but I make it last a non-zero amount of time instead, and you still don't notice it. Or I have 2 shades of color, 2 objects in 2 different shades, and I put them side by side, and you tell me whether you can tell the difference. Just noticeable difference. Or I start playing chimes at various volumes. And I see when you first notice that there's a chime going off, just noticeable difference. But this is a little bit different. I'm not sure how I want to classify that difference, but this is a little bit different because those are internal. Whereas a duration, or what am I thinking? We account for sort of just noticeable sensory difference by talking about how 2 objects could differ from one another on the basis of some minimal adjustment in color, or how 2 sounds could differ from one another on the basis of the minimal difference in acoustic quality or volume. Okay. Whereas with our sequence of objects, our knitted frames, let me see here. With our knitted frames, well, okay, suppose there's a critical moment. You feel a shock in your hand. A shock. It's like a 1/10 of a second before, without intervention, the physical system you're maintaining is going to collapse. So, let me get out my physical system. I feel something in my hand that tells me that the physical system is going to collapse if I don't make an adjustment. Now, if you removed that frame, or if you removed partition points so that that frame was subsumed into one of its preceding frames or succeeding frames, then I will not have the signal to update my inputs, and then the physical system will collapse, and then there won't be any states to be talking about. And then there won't be any states to be talking about. Interesting. It's like saying, if I want to continue to describe this maintenance of the physical system activity that I am performing with my left hand here, maintenance of the physical system, I need some of the frames. Well, again, we have the imagined infinite or very large finite number of frames, larger than I could possibly make use of. Alright, and we're saying if we take a chunk of that large finite number out, then I wouldn't get the information needed. We wouldn't have the frames we could reference and then say about them, that is why the behavior changed, and that's why the behavior deviated from our prediction. Because we don't have the signal that tells us that the behavior must deviate from the prediction. And if the behavior does not deviate from our earlier prediction about the behavior, there won't be a physical system, so all of our predictions will be invalid. We'll go from having correct, then temporarily incorrect, then correct predictions, to having correct, then all incorrect. To the extent that we want to think about the evaluation is continuing even though the physical system has collapsed. As it were, we have a model for this physical system and its values are dancing around in a patterned way. Okay, and now they're not. And yet there are still physical values that you can evaluate out of this system. Or describe into the system if you're modeling it. And so this just noticeable difference is not about two objects that are just a little bit more similar than I can discern to having a physical system that is either maintained or not, depending on whether I have enough frame resolution or not. Though then we could also talk about the various signals that the physical system is going to collapse. The various signals that the physical system is going to collapse. And the idea would be that the various signals that the physical system will collapse would be present in different subframes. So if you took out this chunk where I have my signal, there would still be some other signal. I mean, particularly as the physical system begins to collapse, there would be some signal, some indication that a change in behavior is required, or else an upcoming frame is not going to maintain the physical system. So as opposed to this looping behavior I can execute, it stops here, but I could have had a frame that told me it was going to stop somewhere else. Okay. Now, as a matter of fact, as a technician, it's like now we could use me as an oracle for whether my technique is hitting failure conditions. We could use my brain as an oracle for whether my technique is arriving at failure conditions. If my brain lights up in the midst of this activity, in all likelihood it's because I'm about to fail, where failure corresponds to the collapse of the physical system. And my brain lights up because I have to catch myself, because I have to introduce the alteration to the behavior in order to maintain the physical system. And otherwise I don't worry about it. It just happens in the background. Like panicking, yes. It's like saying that my panic response could be used as a stand-in for evaluation of my technique. Evaluation of whether I'm arriving at a failure condition. What does all of this have to do with the earlier branch where we say that a person is a pattern in the experience streams? And we're talking about how, under the way I want to talk, persons melt into their environments. Melt, overly charged term, I guess. Merge. Persons merge into their environments. And one point here is that we deliver ourselves into a now-present frame. What do I mean? We deliver ourselves into a now-present frame. So if I could stop time and sort of smear all of the experience streams on loop so that I heard the same thing every frame and saw the same thing every frame, well, then we'd have more time to talk about it, I suppose. And then the statement that I have delivered myself into a frame would be more obvious. Whatever I had to do in order to place myself in this position to see this, hear this, feel this, that's what I did. And seeing, hearing, and feeling all of these is the result. But now, things get more complicated when feeling this. Matters get more complicated. Questions get more complicated when feeling this requires a more complicated description. I say, what I currently feel is still air. And you say, oh, still air. A good approximation for still air is nothing. So you're saying you feel nothing. Yes. Tactile-wise. Now, actually, on further elaboration, I feel my feet against the ground and my hands against each other. And I feel my hair on my ear. And some kind of scratch in my back. I feel a lot of things, actually. It's just though there are stretches of skin where I could be feeling wind, but I am not feeling wind. So we say I'm not feeling anything. Okay, now, in a way, what I am feeling on those broad stretches of skin that is exposed to air is also a complicated physical system. The drafts and eddies of the air are minor, but being minor does not render them less complex. Well, I don't know, maybe injecting more information into the system is going to make them more complex. Injecting more energy into the air. Making there to be wind, for instance, might allow for the construction of more complex. But we don't have any meaning. Yeah, we're using a colloquial meaning for the word complex here, so. But what is my point? My point is that there is a physical system that is exposed, e.g. to my arm, over here. Just the air, a non-stop bombardment into my arm. Now, we could grant ourselves talk about the nervous system and how there's some sort of minimal threshold for nervous system activity. But what am I wanting to get out of this? Well, I'm saying we want there to be some difference in our description of this, where I am maintaining a physical system, but all we've granted ourselves access to is talking about sensations in my hand, the feeling in my hand. Okay. Now, do I also want to grant myself access to mathematical models? That's where we could start talking about complexity. For instance, I say, there's some mathematical model that describes what this feels like in my hand. The cord as it presses against my hand. Okay. Similarly, there is some mathematical model that explains the rush of air against my legs. The rush, the movement of air against my legs. The low energy movement of air against my legs. Okay, if we don't have access to the mathematical models, by what other means am I to say that one is more complex than the other? Why would I say maintenance of this physical system is a more complex experience than having a light draft rustle the hairs on my legs? It's not physically more complex. The mathematical model we require to describe the flow of air against my leg could be just as complicated as the mathematical model we require for this. This might even be relatively simple because you get access to pendula. Every time it's like my hand is following a curve, okay, and now it's a different pendulum in each frame because my hand is adjusting its position, but you get some of the math of pendula to ease descriptions of the behavior of this physical system, whereas you'd have to have mathematical descriptions of flow to talk about air against my legs, against the hair on my legs. So in that regard, this is not a more complex experience. But then why would I care about the mathematical model that is required to describe the air against my legs? Whereas maybe it's more obvious why I would care about the mathematical model required for this. And on the other hand, I'm not thinking through a mathematical model. This is born of habit. This is a Rube Goldberg machine, in a way, albeit a sort of looping Rube Goldberg machine that can deliver, instead of delivering the ball to the end of a circle, or end of a circuit, rather, end of a pass through the machine, it delivers the ball back to the beginning. Or sometimes it will deliver a ball to a different beginning that also gains access to the same machinery. It's more like a pinball machine, I guess. Let me think here. When I talk about the complexity of this behavior, when I describe it for myself or when I'm in the process of learning it, at no point do I reference a mathematical model. It is only when I'm doing philosophy, stepping back, that I am struck by, yes, this could be modeled. Okay. There's some mathematical model that succeeds at projecting into this object in the way we established with the interlocutor. That idea of projecting a mathematical model into the world. You have a mathematical model for a video. Okay. What do I mean? You have a video of me manipulating the weights. Okay. And now you examine the video and you refine and you refine and you refine a description of this object. Okay. And then you line up inputs into this object with each frame in the video. And then you feed that alignment of object to input into a three-dimensional model, which shows you a video. And the video you generated and the video you received are the same, so you say that your model is correct. Okay, that's the idea of projecting a mathematical model into the world, as if there's a ghost overlay on this object in my hand. And if it turns out that we were wrong about the input or wrong about the object, well, the only thing it would mean to be wrong about either the input or the object is that they begin to differ. And then on further investigation, we could come up with an accounting for how they differed. But if the videos do not differ from one another, there's no sense to talking about how the objects differed or the inputs differed. And then I suppose we either tailor the object or tailor the input to make the videos realign whenever they misalign. And now I'm observing that in the process of learning to do this, I didn't reference a mathematical model. I'm not currently referencing a mathematical model. I am struck by our ability to project a mathematical object into this object only now that I'm doing philosophy. And then, supposing, rolled the dice. That was not good. Rolled the dice. Hold on. But even without the mathematical model, I'm still motivated to say that this is a more complicated aspect of my experience. Well, why do I want to talk about the complexity? It's as it were, we discern what the more complex of our experiences are, not by rendering a judgment about which are more complex. We incidentally render a judgment about the complexity of our experiences by engaging in discussions about one and not engaging in discussions about the other. And this is like Wittgenstein's observations in the remarks about some of the set paradoxes, or maybe even about the incompleteness theorems, where Wittgenstein observes that the point of proofs is not to figure out a way to construct a string that says this statement is true. The point of proofs is to convince us of something, but receiving a string, constructing a mechanism that delivers a string to us that says this string is true, doesn't convince us of anything, except that, it convinces us that when you apply the machinery of proof to whatever your input was, that you got the desired output, I guess, or this output at any rate. What is the point here? The point of proving is to convince us of something, to prove something. Okay. Describing how this is related to the current observation is difficult. The current observation is that we don't... So I'm talking about the relative complexity of this experience of maintaining this physical system in my hand, as opposed to the complexity of flow of air against the hair on my legs. Okay. Now again, mathematically they might be equally complex. Even the flow of air might be more complex than this, because once again, the minimal model we require can leverage pendula, which we have solved so far as I know, whereas we haven't solved flow, though we have better and worse approximations, so far as I know, but I don't really know anything about the subject matter in these areas. But okay, but the point is, we don't care about the complexity of the mathematical models. We're saying that, right, and I don't render judgment about the complexity of my activities in the way we're imagining here. As it were, I don't examine my activities and compare their complexity classes, as it were. Instead, I perform activities and then I either talk about them or don't. Or in learning to perform an activity, I had to engage in some lengthy sequence of training events, or I didn't. Okay, and both of these would be better metrics for complexities of an activity than the minimal mathematical model required to capture all of the details. The minimal mathematical model required for projection into the world such that we capture every frame. Now what is the idea? I want to get us all to agree to say that I am the activity in my hand. Or that a phrase like this makes sense in the context of saying that I am a pattern in my experience. It's like I could put my hands on anything in the environment. Did the wall light up? I suspect it did not. Now I'm getting close to the screen. Is that lighting up? Yeah. And why is that lighting up? Because I don't want to touch my screen. Because my daily practice of being around a screen doesn't involve touching it. In fact, it involves not touching it actively. If I get close to touching my screen, recoil as if it's a stove. Now you might want to say, it's lighting up because, well, like this useful demonstration object, this object is red hot, or even white hot. This object is the hottest. Well, no, in the environment, probably the mouse or the keyboard. Currently, this object is the hottest. It's as it were, heat flows from my hand into the object. Though really what I mean is more like intention flows through my hand into the object. Something like this. Intention flows through my hand into the object. Intention lights up the screen. Is the object lit up now? So this isn't a characteristic of the object. Now it's not lit up. Why? Because I don't undertake this hand position so often. Because this is for purely demonstration purposes. But I think the point here would I think we suppose the point here to be, or we want the point here to be, like, we want this accounting to grate on our ears. Like, how could this not be as complex as the object here? The object itself doesn't change. Okay, and I'm pointing out that that's a metaphysics. You're thinking through a metaphysics. Okay, and now that observation just doesn't strike me as all that persuasive anymore, not because I've become a metaphysician, but because I just don't care about metaphysics anymore. Or at least not in the same way. Like, that argument would have struck me as quite interesting in the past. You say, we have objects, we have inputs to objects. The objects are like functions that take an initial state of the object, an input rather, and produce an output. Okay, then the object doesn't change, unless, I suppose, in the event of operating, where you're operating with the object, if a thread came loose, and now the facts are different. The facts about the weights on the thread are different because a thread came loose and wafted off into the wind. Or if a chip of copper flies off and now the weight is different. It's an interesting jump where you could have a sparking off of copper that changes the facts about the weights. And you'd want to say, well, it wouldn't be a large shift, or it doesn't have to be a large shift. As it were, I'm maintaining the physical system, and now if there were a copper spark, then we're on as it were, a parallel track in maintaining the physical system. Because no difference that would be produced by such a sparking off would be large enough that it introduces different behavior in the object. It's like you'd want to imagine isolating my inputs down until even a sparking's weight difference between two tracks would lead to a difference in outcome. Like we want to imagine some edge case at the boundary of the heat map, as it were, some edge case where if I have the full weight, my input is correct and the physical system is maintained. Whereas if I have a sparking off, then I don't have the full weight and the physical system is not maintained. But it's not clear that we can produce such an edge case. It sounds like we'd have to be able to do so, but I'm not sure why we think that. What is my point here? Well, but I'm saying that otherwise, in our metaphysics, in our object-based metaphysics, we want to say we have the object, which is like a function that takes an initial state of the object, an input, and outputs an output state of the object, outputs a final state of the object. Okay. And why did I want... Right, well there, in that way of speaking, just our way of accounting for the ontology, our way of accounting for what is present to be talked about, to be discussed, sets us up to be talking about a mathematical model. The grammar is easy to take as a framework for a mathematical model, the semantics of a mathematical model, wanting only the syntax. Whereas if we didn't start with an object-based metaphysics to begin with, if we didn't start with an object-based metaphysics, then, well, I guess I'm not as readily struck by the idea that I should be talking about objects. So I say, the object in the current state is not lit up. But how can the object differ? The object is a function that takes inputs and produces outputs. Okay, and now I'm saying now the object is lit up because it's incorporated into my activity. Okay, but all this is doing is establishing the metric that I'm using for talking about litness and darkness. I'm not... Well, you might say I'm outlining an alternative metaphysics or something. But I'm not revealing something about objects directly. If I'm revealing anything about objects here, what I'm revealing is that you don't have to start with an object-based metaphysics. As in, there are alternatives to talking about objects, or alternatives to accounting for physical systems in terms of objects. Well, physical systems. Alternatives to accounting for the objects of my experience and the reasons I'm interested in them. This parallel track idea. It's related to yesterday's consideration of delaying an input in order to choose the output, delaying the start to an input sequence in order to select an input sequence. This is on full display in manipulating this object. I can introduce controllable perturbations by delaying. Well, and effectively what that means is I hit a certain position, and what I mean by delay is that I allow this to behave as if it were a pendulum. So now this stays on its track qua pendulum for some period of time, and then I re-engage. But my re-engagement occurs when the weight is in a translated position, is in a different position along its arc. If I had continued my input, the pendulum would still, well, the weight, not the pendulum, we need a separation here, the weight would continue around. The pendulum is obliterated the instant I change my hand position. in the sense that when I stop my hand motion, the pendulum is of a type. It's like the dependent type of this pendulum. The dependent type, depending on how I stopped, when I stopped, what it means for me to stop, I suppose. So I stop, I create an instance of the dependent type, being this initial state of a pendulum with its characteristics. Then it continues to loop around if I remain stopped, and then I can re-engage. If I had remained engaged the entire time, the weight would still move like this, as the video is showing. Similar in both cases, the weight is moving down like this, but I'm instantiating a new dependent type for the pendulum in every instant as I move the hand. Okay, so I say, this pendulum is obliterated when my hand moves. Okay, which is not saying anything exciting except to say that if I stopped my hand, we would get one track of a pendulum, and given that I do not stop my hand, we get parallel instances. We get frame translated by one, and we get type translated by one. And so what is the idea here? Right, delaying. Where do I get the idea of a good delay? But let's keep in mind, what is it that I'm doing by delaying? Well, so I have my standard motion. It keeps a tight loop, okay? We could choose whatever inputs we wanted to choose. This is a sort of base case where I don't delay, okay? Now, my hand follows the pendulum around. I feel my arm being directed by the weights. I'm going in the same direction. It's like I'm throwing the weight, and then I'm keeping my hand around it to feel where it's going, which is in turn slowing down the weight, I suppose. There's some kind of contact between my hand and the weight that's changing its behavior, but that's minimized intentionally. So now I'm following the weight as it moves forward. All right. Following the weight as it moves around. And that's my delay. That's where I allow a pendulum of a chosen type to persist and follow along its track for a longer period of time before I intervene and change both the type and the direction, I guess. So am I running math in my head? No, I rarely am. I don't do much math in my head. If by that you mean speaking math, using my inner monologue, no. yet something is telling me just how long I should delay. If I delayed less long or more long, I would notice perturbations that I did not want to imbue into the physical system. And then I'd have to correct for them. I'm not having to perform many corrections, so I know this process is going well. Now it's not, but it was. I don't have to perform as many corrections. I think this activity becomes more talk-aboutable when there's some external metronome, e.g. some external signal for when an event should be occurring. Because then my delays can be targeted in order to line up with a beat. I think there's more to what I'm doing with my hand than what I'm describing, but it's difficult to say because, again, I'm not choosing my hand motions by reference to a model. I'm not choosing my hand motions by reference to mathematics. If I were, then it would be easy to say what my hand is doing. There would be a finite description of what my hand is doing, and there would be nothing more to it. So at any rate, I could finitely finish my description of what my hand is doing, supposing I were following such a finite command. There'd be like, I say, I am doing this input sequence, though it's interesting how many steps that removes between the performance of an action and the mathematical model that we use to describe the action. I say, there's my input sequence in the mathematical model. I can place the input sequence into a projection of the mathematical object, or I can use my hand and put that sequence into the actual object. Well, that's odd. Why can I do the same thing that a function can do? I'm a human and a function is an abstract object. Yeah. Grammatical convenience, I suppose. So I have an input sequence. Let me see here. See, what am I trying to say? Right, well, if I had that input sequence conception of what I'm doing, if I took myself to be following along with an input sequence, or my own behavior to be me choosing those inputs in that sequence, all there would remain to describe is a kind of, what is the word? The stochastic term. Epsilon? I don't remember. Doesn't matter. Sure, epsilon. The remaining epsilon term. Okay, so you have the object, my selection of input, and then a little bit of wiggle room because we're not perfect in our description of the object. Though how could we not be perfect in my description of my inputs? Maybe I made a mistake in executing the input. Right, so I'm saying my hand could be doing more than I've just described. I say I'm following the weight around. Okay, and I'm delaying inputs. Well, I'm delaying changes in course of action, changes in hand motion. Delaying when the next action starts, to the extent that I discretize this as a sequence of actions. Where I don't have to do that. I could say this is all one. This is a monad. You could loop it from the beginning, but you can't dissect it into parts meaningfully. I probably wouldn't call that a monad, given how much competition there is for that term. But to the extent that I say this is a sequence of actions that I'm performing, I can talk about delay. Okay. It's like I'm smearing one action out to delay, to allow the physical system to evolve with its current dependent type for a longer period of time before I create a new dependent type to channel the causality, as it were. And now what am I observing? Let's see. Right, so I'm saying I might be doing even more than I've just described. I might be doing more with my hand than I can describe. There might be some effect of what I'm doing with my hand that is critical to the unfolding of this physical system, but where I don't recognize that I'm doing it. As it were, it's in the background of what I think I am doing. I'm following the weight around. Okay, maybe my hand is doing something at the same time that is the more salient action, the more relevant action to point at if I want to talk about the behavior of the weights. How could I not know? Well, again, because I am not selecting my inputs by referencing a mathematical model. If I were selecting my inputs by reference to a mathematical model, there would be the object, my input, in an epsilon term, and then anything I didn't know about what I was doing, anything I didn't know about what I was doing would fall out of either a missed description of the object, a missed description of my input, either gets shunted into the epsilon term, or the combination of both gets shunted into the epsilon term. And then I would only need to describe the occasional case where the behavior was different than what I expected. Or maybe I only have to describe the occasional case where the behavior of the physical system was critically different. Was so different as to draw attention to itself. If there's a wobble in the weights, well, there might not be anything it means for there to be a wobble in the weights. When I accounted for the object and I accounted for my inputs into the object, did I leave room for wobble? Could there be a wobbling? Maybe it's in the epsilon term. So wobbling is a pattern in the epsilon term, in the stochastic term. persons are patterns in the sensory fields. Okay. And for some as yet unknown, or maybe we've covered it a little bit, for some as yet unknown reason, we want to restrict how we talk about objects. We don't want to talk about mathematical models of objects. We want to talk about we're saying, I melt into the environment. I find myself in the midst of an action, and therefore experiencing whatever one experiences while in the midst of that action. And now once again, that sounds like a triviality. Experiencing whatever one experiences while in the midst of the action. Okay, the way of denuding this description of its triviality is to elaborate on what one is doing. Well, two different ways to denude the description of its triviality. We could create an interface at the skin, as it were, and then have a mathematical model. And then when I say what I experience when I am in the midst of the action is whatever the simulated skin reports when we project the weights into the hand. Whatever the skin reports when we project the physical event into the hand. That's what I experience while in the midst of the activity. How could you deny it? And then the alternative routing is to say we elaborate. We denude this description of its triviality by elaborating on technique. Well, by elaborating on saying by elaborating on the activity doesn't pick this out specifically. Because the mathematical model also has a claim. The mathematical model stated in terms of the object and the input sequence also has a claim to being a description of the activity, an elaboration of the activity. We're taking a different elaboration route. Instead of talking about the object and inputs, we're talking about object and technique. Abstractly, cumulatively, coincidentally, semantically, object and technique. Syntactically, object and the experience of interacting with the object, the learning that was done over the object. I took off the first segment of the day. I've been wobbling a bit. I had my days down. I was putting in the 3 hours at the beginning, then 5 hours, then 3 hours every day. Well, 3.5 even in the last segment. And I'm wobbling a little bit. I find it difficult to get back onto that track. That was quite exhausting. I slept in. Which of the available options for how I could be spending my time not studying, I guess sleeping in is a good one. Get the sort of minimal multiplier on my time for consolidation of memory and so on. Anyway, I'm going to step away for a second.